Hi and welcome to another video, this time covering gender and sexuality in the early modern world. This is the first of two videos covering specific topics. First of all, right out of the gate, I want to clarify something that I think it's extremely important to understand, and that is that the definition of gender itself. So first of all, gender is not a topic, okay? It's you might get the wrong impression about that because you've had different sessions that deal with specific topics. And I just want to state very clearly that gender is not a topic. It's neither is it women's history. Okay, gender analysis does not have to be about women, and neither does feminist analysis have to be about women. Gender is an analytical category through which any issue can be studied. And I've tried throughout the course and throughout the lectures and throughout the discussions and the seminars that we've been having so far. I've tried to illustrate that point, that the gender perspective can be applied to any topic in global history. So as with any innovative approach, re-examining historical processes through gender necessarily improves our understanding of them. So it's important to keep this in mind and to move forward having this concept and this idea very clearly understood. Now, and here I borrow from Mary Weisner Hanks, who's a leading historian of global history, in that gender and global history, that is, are two lenses that have been used largely separately to revision history in the last several decades, and putting them together allows us to create both telescopes and microscopes to see further and find new things we've never seen before, and to see familiar things in completely new ways. And I think that she illustrates very clearly why we need to run away from older conceptions of gender as being purely a field that should be like strictly about issues that have to do with women, or issues that have to do with marriage and family and sexuality. That is not the case. I have scanned this text for you. It's now on Aula Global, so feel free to have a look at it. And no, it's not included in the exam, so don't worry, this is not a required reading for the exam. It is a required reading for life. All right, so that being said, I'm now going to tackle a series of topics that have been explored from a gender perspective for a long time. And when dealing with these specific topics, you will see gender really is a factor that cannot be overlooked in order to completely comprehend and to completely understand what is going on in the historical process. So the first big topic that we're going to look at is marriage and family structure. Now, even though we're dealing with a global history course, there's absolutely no way that we can cover every single aspect of marriage and family structure in the time frame that we have for the course. Neither will it be possible to cover every single manifestation and every single aspect of marriage and family throughout the world. So we're just going to focus in specific aspects of marriage. So we're going to look at the evolution of early modern Europe in particular, and we're going to see that there are two regions that roughly, and this is again generalizing quite a bit, we have a northwest pattern of marriage, and then we have a Mediterranean pattern of marriage. We're going to discuss the issue or Morganatic marriage, that is marriage of people from different social ranks. And in particular, we're going to look at that in terms of marriage in Georgian Britain, that is Britain in the latter half of the 18th century. And we will see how marriage is being codified in a new and different way. Now, codification of marriage patterns has been a staple of political management of a particular territory or particular population. And we will see how the intermarriage of different collectives, different groups or different ethnicities has been used as a form of political control in various empires. We're going to look at 3 empires as examples: the Mughal Empire, the Qing Empire, and we're going to look at Spanish America with a particular focus in New Spain. Then, after examining these various aspects of marriage, with a look in the evolution of the process in Europe and miscegenation as a form of political control, we're going to explore the issue of captivity. And I will define captivity as the kidnapping of people of European descent. And we're going to look at these kidnappings in North America and the Maghreb. There are other places where we could look at this particular phenomenon, but we see this phenomenon constructing an entire narrative and typifying a certain relationship between a different group of peoples in a specific way in those particular cases. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So here I'm going to be quoting different authors throughout the session, and you will see the authors' names in parentheses along with the date. If you want more information about particulars, don't hesitate and send me emails. So first of all, in Europe, the rules of marriage were defined by the Christian Church primarily. The most important thing in order to get married was consent. The parties that were involved in the marriage, at least in theory, had to agree to become married. And of course, you needed to marry outside your family and outside even people to whom you were bound by spiritual kinship. That is, godparents could not marry their godchildren, for example. And of course, there were certain degrees of separation that needed to be established in that regard. Now, the age was also important. The age of consent to marriage was 12 years of age for girls and 14 for boys. However, we'll see that the average, especially in the 17th and 18th century, the average age was much older than that, in particular in the Northwest pattern of marriage. Now, special dispensation to these rules could be obtained, particularly if you were a person of means, whether you were a noble person or you were part of the royalty or you were a very, very rich person. You were able to find loopholes and to acquire special dispensation so that you could marry, you could betroth younger people, or you could marry within your family group. You could look at European royalties for that. There's a lot of intermarriage there. And of course, consent was only required in theory, because in the end, marriages were social contracts, and there was a lot more that came into play. All right, so how did one become married? Well, it was important to express the will to get married in front of a church official, a priest, and there had to be witnesses. So these words needed to be pronounced in front of other people so that people could ascertain that in fact people were becoming married. And sometimes sex was also important. Consummation could be an important factor. Impotency, for example, could be grounds for the annulment of a marriage. And like I said before, the average age of marriage for women kept growing throughout the 1500s and the 1600s. And in the end, in places like Britain, you had an average of about 22 years of age for women who became married. So we see progressively women becoming married at an older age. And we'll see that that has a lot of implications, social and economic implications. Now, I've been talking about these 2 different patterns of marriage in Europe. Let's talk about the Northwest model, the so-called Northwest model first. So this is the model that we have in Britain, France, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and the German states. So sometimes related to Protestantism, although not exclusively. Now, in these societies, the average age of marriage for for both men and women was the mid to late 20s. So, but by that time, people who became married had already been somewhat emancipated, or had at least had developed some means to come into this union. So they were not entirely dependent on their families. And then once they got married, households would almost always include only the spouses and their children, and perhaps non-kin servants. That is, there was the households did not include a large extended family. And then, because the age of marriage was delayed, we also have a strange phenomenon where a large part of the population and an increasing part of the population remained unmarried. So somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population never got married. And in some places, it was close to 25%. So a lot of people did not get married in these Northwest Europe societies. So, however, this didn't mean that they were not seen as outliers or suspicious in some way. In fact, this segment of the population, as McNabb says, occupied an awkward, ill-defined space in the social order. Perhaps that's the reason why, as we will see in our lecture on witchcraft, people who were unmarried were targeted more often as witches during this persecution. But we'll get to that story in another video. Now, fertility and family life differed between Europe and this Western Northwest Europe and the colonies. For example, by 1700, in Britain, women were having an average of 4.6 children, so 4 or 5 kids per woman. But in New England, the proportion was much higher. In New England, a woman would have 8 or 9 children in average. So depending on the context and depending on the specific area, these marriage patterns were different, even within this particular Northwest Europe system that we're talking about. Perhaps the reason is that New England was always in need for more labor, and having more children allowed farmers and people to work larger extensions of land. That's one possibility. All right, so what about the Mediterranean? The Mediterranean, so-called Mediterranean pattern includes the Spanish-controlled lands, Southern Europe as well, so Italy and the Balkans, and also Eastern Europe. So that would be Poland and Moravia, Austria, and then moving towards Russia as well. In these areas, people tended to marry much younger. People married as teenagers. So they were still dependent on their families and not really, they hadn't really developed their own estate when coming into the marriage. Now, that's part of the reason why households were multi-generational and included extended families. People tended to live with their cousins and their uncles, and most importantly, their grandparents. So we have this large familial groups living together. Think about the Catalan Masia, for example, where an extended family cohabitated in the same space. So if you married into a family, you would go and live under the father of the bride's house, for example, or the other way around. Now, in many of these societies, there's an emphasis on female sexual purity, and there's also the practice of dowry, the payment of dowry. In fact, the price of dowries were so high that in Florence, for example, people had to rely on public institutions to cover for these expenses. So institutions such as the Monte delle Doti was founded in Florence to provide money for women in order to be able to get married. Young women also had an alternative. They could join a convent if they couldn't afford to get married. more like their families had the option of send her into a convent if they couldn't afford her getting married. So that meant that fewer people stayed unmarried and outside religious life. So many men in their 20s and 30s would remarry when, if they lost their wife, they would continue to be married. So they wouldn't carry on living as widows. And they would always, or generally, marry much younger women in order to secure the growth of the family. More children per woman were born in this Mediterranean area than in the north. And of course, childbearing was an important part of familial life. Here we have a scene depicting the birth of the Virgin Mary, but it also tells us a little bit of what would a middle to high class birth would have looked like in Renaissance Florence in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. Okay, so does that mean that in the northern countries there was no such thing as a dowry? Not at all. In fact, that's what a morganatic marriage meant in Georgian Britain. So marriage between two people, the morganatic marriage is marriage between two people of different social status. That is normally a bridegroom from the nobility that would marry the daughter of a wealthy commoner. And this commoner would pay a substantial dowry, a substantial amount of money to the noble father of the bridegroom. And here we have William Hogarth's The Marriage Settlement, also called Marriage à la Mode, is one of a series of paintings that he made about the subject of marriage. And this artist is always has a very keen eye, is always very critical about societal practices in the London of the mid 18th century. We can see here the merchant is counting all the money that he's paying the gout afflicted duke that is sitting on the chair. You can see a palace that he was building and in the window, but the construction works have stopped, so he needs the money in order to continue to live in the life of a nobleman. That's why he's marrying his daughter. You can see that the daughter is actually looking very dismayed. Her husband is ignoring her. Is that fellow with the snuff box to the right of her, wearing the blue jacket. And instead, the lawyer, that is another commoner, is trying to console her of her melancholy. Spoiler alert, in the following paintings, this marriage will end up really, really, really badly. So if you're curious about that, look up William Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode. So this type of marriage had not been really criticized during the 15th and 17th century. For example, Henry VIII famously married 6 women, and only 2 of them were of royal blood, right? The rest of them were commoners. So it wasn't really a thing. But in the 1700s, as more and more merchants are becoming wealthier than the aristocracy, the aristocracy becomes increasingly in need of establishing these marriages, and thus we have them criticized by the society at large and by intelligent artists such as William Hogarth. So, in fact, love and marriage was a point of debate in the society of London in the late 17th century, the early 18th century. And it was something that was debated in the salons and the coffee houses, and it was constantly being something of a topic of conversation. So there was this idea of whether it was mutual love or other things, or companionship and partnership, the foundations of a successful marriage. That was an ongoing debate in London society. Now, a lot of people actually married they tended to elope, they tended to escape the social constraint and got married in what was called the Fleet marriage. Now, there was this prison in London called Fleet Prison, and there was a legal vacuum where preachers could marry people there without the need of presentation of a marriage license. So people who wanted a quick marriage or who wanted to avoid asking permission to their parents to get married, they would just go there and get a Fleet marriage instead. And this is a high proportion of the marriages that were happening in London at the time. So that irregularity gave rise to the codification of marriage. And by 1753, pressure from parents who felt that their children were taking away opportunities that could happen from having them marry someone more advantageous, gave some pressure to Congress, to the British Congress, for them to pass the 1753 Marriage Act. So that meant that marriage will now be stipulated and standardized, and parental consent would be required for couples who wish to marry under the age of 21. Now, this codification of marriage in such a way meant that a lot of people who were getting married differently, who were getting married under common law, that is, they just cohabitated for a number of years and then they were, in fact, considered married without the need of presenting licenses and without the need of consent by the parents. These people who had been married that way now found that their marriages were illegal. And that gave rise to a great number of illegitimate children. In fact, illegitimacy becomes a big problem in Georgian London right until the 1830s. So it continues to be a big, big problem. And in fact, the rise of illegitimacy has been said to be a part of relaxation in the attitudes towards sex. But in fact, it has more to do with this redefinition of marriage. And of course, that also meant the decline of status of women in London society, because they were in fact taken advantage of and then abandoned by men who did not have now a legal obligation to them anymore. Okay, so that's marriage in Georgian Britain. Let's change gears completely, and now let's look at another phenomenon surrounding marriage and surrounding reproduction and surrounding sexuality, and that's miscegenation. Now, miscegenation is a term that is very quickly falling out of favor. It has very negative connotations because it was used to typify a crime back in the 19th century and a good portion of the 20th century, certain parts of the world, such as apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow United States, where it was forbidden for people of different ethnic backgrounds to get married. And this crime was typified miscegenation. So the word miscegenation in historical scholarship is quickly falling out of favor. In fact, I was struggling to find a different definition, and I'm sorry to say I couldn't find one. So I'm sticking to that, but with the caveat that it's not the nicest of terms to use. Okay, so let's look at how this concept of miscegenation was used as a means to political control in 3 different empires. So first, the Mughal Empire. Now, as you know, you've learned in Guillermo's session, the Mughal Empire was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious polity. And it was a very well-structured polity. It was a very well administered empire, especially in the 16th century. Now, royal marriage with elites of major groups, major ethnic groups, such as Iranians and Rajput and Deccani peoples, slowly and gradually became a means of political control by the Mughals. And in fact, marriages between the Mughal royal princes and rulers of these elites served to articulate the military and fiscal structure of the empire. But in fact, gender was a crucial factor in determining how this works. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So local elites belonging to a different ethnicity, not part of the Mughal royal elite, would marry their daughters to the Mughal emperors and princes, their daughters. And through these marriages, they were able to secure imperial postings. They will become imperial officials and acquire special status in court. Now, the Mughal emperors and the royal princes would take brides from different ethnic groups, right? There's only a few exceptions. And in fact, Rajput wives, that's Hindi brides, were taken as wives by the emperors a lot during the first years of the Mughal Empire. And at first, they didn't even require them to convert to Islam. Later on, they were required to convert before marrying. But yes, in the opposite direction, Mughal princesses were not married outside the Mughal royal family. They were mostly married within the family, and there were very few exceptions where they would marry outside. So you see that belonging and relationship to and from the royal family, it's also determined by notions of gender very clearly. Now, another example could be China during the Qing Empire. Now, before conquering China, the Manchu polity divided the population, and especially the elites, in kinship groups, right, that were called banners. These were also the subdivisions of the Manchu Empire. So you knew how and where to serve in the Manchu Empire's army, depending on what banner you belong to. And here you have a photo of warriors from a specific banner. So these are also called clans. The banners are also called clans. And clansmen constituted the elite of the Manchu polity. Now, after the Manchu conquest of China in 1644 and the establishment of the Qing dynasty, this entrance into China reestablished or rearranged ethnic hierarchies in China. And they also incorporated Han and Mongol banners into the mix, right? So during this period, because the Manchu were the absolute, were the highest ranking the highest ranking nobility, Han Chinese constantly tried and very often succeeded in becoming members of the Qing nobility by marrying Manchu noble women, by marrying Manchu banner women. And Han women from the banners, so Han banner women, were allowed in the imperial harem. But Han women that were not part of the banners were excluded. So commoners were excluded. Only Han women that belonged to a specific banner were able to become part of the imperial harem. Now, after the reign of the Yongzheng emperor in the mid 18th century, we see that status is no longer as important as gender. And gender starts to become the paradigm through which sexual morality is applied. And the intention of the Qing emperors is to try to apply the law in the same way across ethnic groups in China. So the Manchu and the Mongols and the Han are going to be now treated in the same way, where it relates to intermarriage and sexual conduct. So Manchu and Han bannermen could now take Han commoner brides, but Manchu and Han banner women were not allowed to marry commoner hand bridegrooms. So you see, if you were a woman of the elite, you could not marry outside the elite. But if you were a man of the elite, you could marry outside the elite. So gender now becomes the decisive factor here. Here's a picture that illustrates clearly how a family structure was conceptualized in China under the Ming Dynasty, under the Qing Dynasty, sorry. We have an image of a marriage, and you can see the bride in the center offering some tea to the mother of the groom. The mother and the father of the groom are the central figures, and they are the ones who are sitting down. And in fact, the groom is not at all central to this picture. He's over there in the right-hand side of the image. So the woman was actually being introduced into the larger family union, and she was bound through filial piety to the family, to the parents of his bridegroom. More than to the groom himself. Okay. Now, how did miscegenation work in a more European context? So let's look at Spanish America. Now, in Spanish America, of course, miscegenation is just the reality. It's just the way things had to work. Early in the colonial period, exogamous unions, so marriage outside your own kinship or ethnic group, just arose out of necessity, because generally there were not a lot of European and African women migrating into the Spanish colony. Now, there were a lot of them, but they were just vastly outnumbered by the men. So multi-ethnic households were a reality from a very early stage. There were attempts at segregating the population. The Spaniards were supposed to live in the center of town, and no indigenous people were supposed to live there, but that ended up not working really. Remember, we talked about the case of Puebla when we talked about the China Poblana, right? Puebla was originally intended to be an exclusively Spanish city, and that didn't happen at all. So it's important to know, however, that despite the fact that it was a very mixed society, this notion or this idea that we had that the white Spaniards were on top all the time in every context is not entirely accurate, because status was not always determined along ethnicities. So indigenous nobilities continue to be important and continue to assert a certain degree of influence, a certain degree of authority, in particular in places that had contributed to the conquest. So the Tlaxcalteca nobility, for example, continued to be a thing. Now, of course, disease and the encomienda system reduced the population. And so gradually, ethnicity became an increasingly important marker of social status. So by the 1700s, it was very clearly reified as the marker of your place in the hierarchy. And this is the moment in time where we have the development of the image that you see here. And this is a casta painting, right? The Español y India mestiza. So from a Spanish and a Spanish man and an indigenous woman, you get a mestizo. Well, in this case, a mestiza girl. Now, this is a very interesting genre. In fact, it's the only non-religious pictorial genre that developed in New Spain, and to a lesser extent, it also developed in Peru. And we have depictions of these marriages of people and a very clear definition of to what ethnicity they belong to, and what is the product of their union in terms of race. So oftentimes these images are portrayed to be reflective of how the judicial system in New Spain worked. In reality, I think this is more a case of wishful thinking rather than actual legal definitions, right? Here we have, I couldn't help myself, here we have a Chino, right? Who knows what this Chino is? Is he Filipino? Is he Chinese? Is he some other thing? It's impossible to tell. But apparently you get a Genízaro from a Chino and an India union. So these paintings have different formulas and different definitions, and they're inconsistent from one painting to the next. Of course, they always depict the Spaniards as better dressed and evidently higher ranking, but we also have different people and people of color also wearing nice and fine clothes and so forth. So it's difficult to say, are we talking about legal reality, or is it painting that reflects some sort of wishful thinking, some sort of depiction of how New Spain should be? I think that ethnicities were much more muddled, and it was very clear who was white and who wasn't. But beyond that, it was a more difficult thing to really tackle. So here you see 3 different paintings and all the different combinations and definitions that arose. Okay, so was the process of mestizaje or miscegenation a thing unique to Spanish America? Well, no. French America also had this phenomenon. In Canada, a focus on conversion of the indigenous population to Catholicism, and of course the lack of French women in the colony vis-a-vis men, fostered the emergence of mixed European and First Nation ancestry groups. And these people collectively are called the Métis. That is mestizo in French. The Métis are actually now considered a specific ethnic group legally in Canada. So they remain a specific group, a very small one at that. It's only a little over 500,000 people today in Canada. So how is it that mestizaje did not influence New France in the same way as it did Spanish America? Well, it was because of an influx of white women. And you see, between 1663 and 1673, Governor Jean-Baptiste Colbert started a new policy, and he managed the king to sponsor the voyage of 850 women or so, a little bit, something around that figure, 850 young single or widowed women. These were mostly poor women who were sent from France to Quebec in order to marry local Frenchmen and thus grow the white population. They were called together the Filles de Roi, the king's daughters. And more than 700 of the king's daughters married and began reproducing very shortly after arriving. So they were basically there as baby factories, right? So the multiplication of the white population marginalized the Métis as a group, and from then on, miscegenation became an increasingly rare phenomenon in Canada. So that's what happened. That's what happened there. Here's a depiction. These women have been now celebrated in Canadian traditional history for some bizarre reason, but they have become a staple of Canadian and especially Quebecois folklore. In fact, these women are the ancestors of about a third of the population of Quebecois today. So they had a profound impact on the composition of the population of Canada. Now, since we're in Canada, let's go ahead and move towards our other topic. That's captivity. Now, captivity is a tricky subject, and it specifically refers to the kidnapping of white people, often women, by Native Americans, and also in another context, Maghrebi pirates, Maghrebi privateers. Now, this phenomenon is associated with wars in both cases. The war between various states allowed for certain vacuum that enabled people to go ahead and kidnap human beings in order to acquire ransoms or do other things with these people. Now, in North America, women who endured the experience wrote about it, right? And one famous, in the Maghrebi case as well, as we will see, but one famous example of this is Mary Rowoldson's description of her experience as an abductee of the Iroquois in North America. Now, I've always found this topic a little bit tricky, because why does it always constitute captivity when it concerns white people? See, for example, the case of Pocahontas is not considered to be a story of captivity, but in fact, Pocahontas was actually kidnapped. Her husband was killed, and she was forced to marry John Rolfe. She was forced to convert to Christianity. Then she was transported to London. She had 2 kids. She was then called Rebecca when she was living in London, and then she died of pneumonia because she didn't adjust well to the horrible London weather. So why is this not a captivity story? I will just leave that for us to debate in the online session. So captivity arose in New England and New France because among the Iroquois and among other Native American groups, there was a long-standing tradition where warriors would capture people from other groups that they would attack in order to replenish their numbers. So it was a way to symbolically replace individuals lost during the war, individuals lost in battle, or individuals that were being mourned by the warriors. And it was also these captives would then be exchanged as a ritualized, as part of a ritualized gift-giving. So you would always start diplomatic interactions with the exchange of gifts. We have seen this also in our seminars covering Hernán Cortés and his arrival with various indigenous groups, and De Soto and various indigenous groups. We see that this exchange of goods is a staple of diplomatic relations, and that is also the case with the Iroquois and the French. So this reality eventually led to the fact that by 1689, indigenous slaves, they will call the Panis, that's a French interpretation of the term Pawnee, the indigenous group, the Pawnee, they actually outnumbered African slaves 2 to 1. Even though it was technically forbidden to enslave indigenous people in Canada, there was nothing said that you couldn't acquire an indigenous person that was already a slave. So people took advantage of this loophole, and there were a lot of indigenous slaves living in Canada. Now, most conflicts between Native Americans and colonists, especially after King Philip's War from the late 17th century onward, were always instigated by European conflicts. So it was because the Europeans were fighting wars that they would then drag their respective indigenous allies into fighting each other. So wars between England and France and or Spain were also fought in the colonies, and we have a series of wars throughout the better portion of a century, affecting the New World as well. Now, here you can see the correlation. These wars are called with different names in America, in the Americas, but they relate to specific wars in Europe, some of which you may be familiar with. So the Queen Anne's War is the War of Spanish Succession, and the 7 Years' War is the French and Indian War. It's just the same conflict, in case you look it up in the literature, so that you can recognize it's actually the same war in several cases. Okay, so French and Native American war parties normally work together. Sometimes you had exclusively indigenous war parties or exclusively French war parties, but more generally you had a combination of the two. And they would take captives in New England regularly in the course of these conflicts. Now, the Abenaki people, for example, were more interested in capturing these people and then wait until the end of the war and then ransom these people that they had kidnapped. The Mohawk, on the other hand, were more likely to try to incorporate them into the ranks. The Mohawk are part of the Iroquois, so they were following this tradition of replenishment of their numbers, ritualistically substituting a person whom they had lost. So they were interested in acculturating or acquiring children, not infants, not babies. Babies and infants were generally killed. But children that were already grown, already healthy, were taken, and also they would take women to fulfill various roles in their society. Now, there's various figures. Okay, I found this article by Vaughan and Richter, and here you have an idea of when these people are captured. So you see in the King's William's War, we have a search of these captures. But most of them, a good chunk of them, were captured during the 7 Years' War, so the French and Indians War. And both men and women were taken. In fact, depending on the conflict and depending on who captured whom, a larger proportion of women were captured. Now, so you see, mostly men were captured, but a good chunk of women were captured as well. Now, what happened to them? That's the last charge. Some of them were ransomed. The majority of them were, or the largest number was ransomed, or we simply don't know what happened to them. And then there were people who died, people who were killed, and people who remained with their captors. Right? About 228 people decided to remain with their captors, and sometimes even refused, or they were forced to return to their home, whether they wanted to or not. And these were mostly women. This was a good portion of these people who decided to stay with their captors were women. So why would they want to stay with their captors? Well, captive women were more likely to be incorporated into native society. Men were more likely to escape or simply die. Now, younger women would be incorporated as wives, either of the Native Americans or wives of the Frenchmen in Canada. Older women became intermediaries between Native Americans and the European colonies. Sometimes they knew how to write, they would become secretaries, they certainly knew the language, so they became sort of diplomats in a way. And then some were taken to New France, and most of a third of the women who were taken to New France decided to convert to Catholicism and to stay. Individual women had different opportunities and more options that they would have in England, and we would look at in New England, and we will see a specific example. And the reason is that women played a more prominent role in New France than they did in rural New England. So, for example, Esther and Mary Seward were captured as children and became prominent figures in Montreal. They were taken by the Native Americans all the way up north to Canada, and there Esther ended up marrying and inheriting his husband's estate. And she actually became Madame de l'Estache. So de l'Estache, sorry. She became a prominent figure. She became a donor. She became preoccupied with aiding nuns and nurses and teachers in her community. Her sister Mary actually joined a convent of Ursuline nuns and became Marie des Anges, and she became a teacher of Native Americans and New England captive children. And this was a profession that did not exist in New Hampshire, where she was from. So, and it's important to note that nuns and mother superiors in particular had a lot of power, had much power, had influence in Montreal society. So oftentimes these women just had more expectations opened up to them by being captured. Now, of course, let's not exaggerate, paint too rosy a picture. Being captured, being kidnapped, being taken away from your family and loved ones was certainly not a good thing to have happen to you. But in some occasions, it did bring some avenues for a different life, in particular to women. So, what about captivity in the Barbary coast? Well, this was a simultaneous story that was going on, and it had a longer development in time. Algiers became a major slave entrepot, and a lot of the people who were traded as slaves in Algiers were Christians kidnapped in southern Europe and in the Mediterranean. So, and we've already spoken about one of them. Remember when we talked about Morocco's entry into West Africa? The leader of the Moroccan army had actually been born in Almeria. He had actually been born in Spain, and he was a eunuch who was actually leading the army of the Sultan in West Africa. So, the Barbary corsairs, as they are also known, are Muslim privateers who would sell captured crew members and passengers to slave holders who would ransom them or will force them into hard labor. And we have this happening beginning in the 13th century. And in fact, some of the fortifications that you see in the European Mediterranean, for example, Tossa de Mar, were built to defend from these slave raids that were conducted by the Barbary privateers. So city-states in the Maghreb, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli began prospering by taking these captives and these slaves. By the 16th and 17th century, they really became a problem. If you recall, for example, Miguel de Cervantes was actually captured as a slave by Barbary pirates, for example. So these cities, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, became suzerain states of the Ottoman Empire. So they were technically under the jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire. And since the Ottoman Empire was at war with Spain and at other moments with France and with states in the Italian peninsula, there was justification for their actions. They were actually privateers working on behalf of this authority, this war that was happening. There were several European punitive expeditions against Algiers and Tunis and elsewhere that they really didn't achieve much, and the slave trade continued well into the 19th century. In fact, here we have a 19th century image of Christian slaves in Algiers. So this becomes a staple of that interaction. And of course, we have narratives, right? One of the more famous one is that of Maria Martin, who was captured and taken as a slave for 6 years. She wrote this one in 1807, so it's rather late in our chronology, but it reflects a lot of the experiences that people endured in this context. So if you're interested, I can point you to this source as well. All right, so that about wraps it up. You see how here gender is an analytical category. We're not discussing these topics from a perspective that they pertain exclusively to women. And we will move to another subject for our next video, and that's the topic of witchcraft. And you'll see there, gender is an analytical category. It's not the topic itself. So thank you, and I'll see you for that. Bye-bye.